Rob Neyer has graced our show before, and our longtime listeners will know that he started his career and approach to the game of baseball working for Bill James, the pioneer of what we now call sabermetrics. Rob made a name for himself with a proliferation of great writing on a fresh perspective on talent management on ESPN.com, where he educated and entertained us from 1996 to 2001. He's written or co-written 6 books, and he's a member of the Baseball Writers Association of America, whose probably most visible function is electing players to the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Why do we like to debate this topic so much? Because why we love potential Hall of Famers gives us a glimpse into what we value. Today, Rob and Pete get into that debate. So please enjoy this conversation with our friend, Rob Neyer.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Rob Neyer, author of Powerball, Anatomy of a Modern Baseball Game, and this is the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, Rob's been on a few times now. It's sort of become an annual thing with a couple of bonus episodes. And it's always so fun to talk to someone that loves baseball like I do and gets the game at a level that makes sense to me. And I don't know where you are with this, Rob, and I know you're also a commissioner of baseball of sorts. But I find the game on the field to be fun, but more of a pastime, and the planning, the logistics, the numbers to be the real fascinating part. Like, I want to know what Andrew Friedman's thinking about. I want to know what all the GMs are thinking about, and you know, how important they are to the product that's on the field.
I think that I'm somewhere in the middle, probably, Pete. I think that if you had said that to me 15 years ago, I would have been right on board with you. Love the game, but am especially interested in what's happening in the front offices, this new statistical thing that's happening. But, you know, frankly, and this doesn't speak very well of me, I realize, but it's gotten so complex that I find myself struggling to even begin to keep up with all the developments. It was one thing when 15 years ago, half the teams might have 1 or 2 people working in their front office on sabermetrics or analytics. Now, when you have every team with multiple people working on those things, and some teams having more than a dozen, maybe even dozens of people working on it, how do we keep up? And I'm sort of well positioned because I can fire off an email to people who are actually inside baseball and get answers to questions that I might have. But I've never really lost the fundamental perspective of being a baseball fan. So I don't think of myself as someone, even though I am, I don't think of myself as someone who can just call up, I don't know, an assistant general manager or the GM of the Twins, whomever it might be. I can do that. I just don't think of myself as someone who can do that, and someone who, so I don't very often. I made some of those calls when I was working on the book, but I still feel like an outsider in my heart. And so I feel somewhat distant from a lot of the things that have happened in baseball because it's happened so fast and there's so much of it. And by the way, unlike 15, 20 years ago, the people inside baseball know 1,000 times more than those of us outside baseball, which just wasn't the case then.
Yeah, that there's something to be said there for sure. The daily performers who have probably the greatest impact on the game on the field are people you've never heard of, because there's 24 people at Dodger Stadium right now looking for advantages, scouring for something. And it does seem like when they sign someone like Russell Martin, you start to reverse engineer why they would make that decision, and you're looking for some confirmation. And maybe it's just, hey, this is our hedge for the year, and, you know, Like I'm sure they don't do this, but they put the numbers together, eliminated the most crappy options and went with these three, see who we can acquire. But the influence of those people for the on the field product is substantial.
Well, I think that's right, and especially, maybe especially isn't the right word, but particularly when it comes to defense, teams know almost exactly with a high level of confidence who the best fielders are, exactly how much better the best fielders are than, say, the next best fielders or the worst fielders. And so they're making decisions based on the fact that this guy's likely going to save us 14 runs in the field rather than this other guy who's going to save us 6. Well, might not sound like a lot, 8 runs over the course of an entire season, but that's essentially one win.
Right.
Which is, as we've been told many times, worth $8 or $10 million. Now, lately there's been some argument over whether that's really a meaningful measure in today's economics. But the fact is, one win, it is a lot. If you can grab one and you can do it cheaply, well, you should. And if you can grab 5 or 6 or 7 in one at a time, now you're a division champion. If you're competitive before that. So the teams, and look, don't get me wrong, organizations like Fangraphs and Baseball Prospectus and Sports Info Solutions, they're doing fantastic work with the data that they've got. And they're light years ahead of where they were 10 years ago, probably. But the teams have everything. The teams know exactly, or almost exactly, how many runs Russell Martin is saving with his glove. Or I shouldn't say teams, because there are still a lot of teams that are well behind the curve, but the Dodgers are not. The Dodgers probably do know almost exactly, because they've got people at this very minute working on quantifying pitch framing, working on calming down the pitcher and making sure that next curveball is 95% efficient rather than 88% efficient. I'm just throwing numbers out there, obviously, but the things that are happening behind the scenes are pretty incredible. I don't think we really have had a full accounting of it yet. I think Ben Reiter, in his book about the Astros, it came out last summer, I think he does a great job in really drilling pretty deep into what the Astros have done. And of course, they're at the forefront of this movement. But there are the Astros, and there are another half dozen teams that are, if not at that level, certainly close. And then another 20 teams that are working on it and probably discovering some interesting things of their own. So there's just there's so much happening. There's so much energy in the front offices right now, intellectual energy and intellectual power and computing power, that it's hard for a mere mortal like me to really get my brain around.
There's also a lot of Astros in your book. We should mention your book, Powerball. It's fantastic, and I'm using the short title. I've read it. It's great. I love baseball. I love what Rob writes. I love VAs. But it's such a neat way to frame a game. We had Jim DeFelice and you on a show earlier. Everybody should go check that out. But you take us through what it's like to watch a game with Rob and talk about things and then dig into some stats. But from a storytelling point of view, not like, oh, there's Jose Altuve. He's his ex-Vorp. And it's a fun way to read a baseball book. And I'll say this, and I've read all your books. I think it's your best book. Like, it's just the easiest for anybody to grab and read who's got a love for baseball.
Well, thank you, Pete, and I really appreciate that. And honestly, a few other people have said that to me, that they think it's my best book. Of course, a few other people still love my third book, which came out a long time ago, the baseball lineups book. But I think this is probably a common sentiment among writers. I would, if I didn't think this last one was my best one, I would feel pretty bad about it.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I'm a smarter, better writer than I was 10 years ago or whenever the last one came out, and certainly 15 years ago when the lineups book came out. But look, we all know that there are a lot of writers whose best books are their early books, and who get worse the longer they go. Now, I think that's probably more common in fiction than the nonfiction, but nobody's ever quantified it. I do want to say one thing about my book, and you were very gracious in having me on the show. We talked about my book for basically just my book for an hour, and I really enjoyed that, and I felt very fortunate that I got a chance to do that. But the one thing about my book that I hope people will really at least think about when they read it is what comes basically at the very end of the book. When it's a very personal thing for me, and that's the direction that I think baseball should be taking. I shouldn't prescribe anything for baseball. That really isn't my job, although I do in the book. What I really want to get across to people is that as writers, and it's certainly as fans too, but as writers or podcasters or radio hosts, we shouldn't be advocating for the profits of the owners. They don't need our help. And we also shouldn't be advocating for the salaries of major league players who also, frankly, don't need our help. They're doing pretty well without us. What's been lost are the fans. I don't see anyone, and I mean that, there's some lip service to it. But basically, I don't see anyone in the media arguing for a better fan experience. Sure, you'll see stuff about, we should have more home run celebrations, which I agree with, and that's for the fans to some degree. But really, it's typically couched in an attack against the traditionalists among the players, and not really advocating for the fans. I mean, when people talk about, well, wouldn't baseball be much better if they could only have more colorful shoes? Well, I'm not sure that's true. A little better, okay, but do most people who go to the ballpark, they can't even see the shoes.
Right.
So it's not really about that. It's really about, again, arguing for the freedom of the players, because we like the players better than we like the owners. I think that's what a lot of it comes down to. But I see very little talk in the media about actually making the game of baseball more entertaining. And that's what we should all be talking about. I don't care if how much money the Rickards family makes off the Cubs or the Steinbrenners makes off the Yankees. I also don't care if Manny Machado makes $175 million on his new contract or $260 million. Where in the universe should that make a difference to somebody like me or you or any fan? I just can't quite get that. And so I make a plea in the book for people to come back to the experience for the fans and not worry so much about the millions and the billions that are floating around out there for all those people.
I will say this, though, about the experience, and I'll point my finger directly at the Angels because that's the most recent ball game I went to. I would like to have the ballpark and the ownership's hand in my pocket a little less obviously. If I go and if I can't buy 3 beers for less than $40 with the tip, that's just, you're overplaying your hand. Same thing with the Giants. You go there and it's like, are you here to wring out every dollar you can out of me? And, that has really taken the game in terms of local, in-person, major league game. It's taken that away from me. I don't want to feel like they're using every opportunity to extract every single possible penny from me. And I know that's probably unfair to them. They've got an operation to run, but
I don't think it's unfair. It's just unrealistic.
Yeah,
because they're going to do that.
Right, they are.
They don't have to make the extra $2 million that year on jacking up the price for beer or whatever it is. They do because that's what businesses are programmed to do. They employ any number of bright people, fine people, whose job is literally to maximize revenue. Now, I'd like to think that if I ran a baseball team, I would do it differently. I'm sure you do too. But once you're sort of in that milieu, that's your job, is to charge as much as you can. I probably purchase 3 beers a year at a ballpark because I'm offended by. It's silly. probably, but to me it's offensive to to pay $10 for a beer, so I just don't do it.
Yeah.
I will get a veggie dog because I like to support the vegetarian food industry. But for the most part, I go to the ballpark. I eat before I get there, or I eat after. So,
but I think that
I
gets
get
to the larger thing is guys like us who are going to do that, we're denied the experience. And I would say that by being a little less, and I'll just use the word greedy, by being a little less greedy, you would likely open up more pocketbooks. More people would. I'd be inclined to go to more games myself and spend more money at the stadium if it was a little more reasonable. And I don't know what that number is, but
right.
And I don't know that they're leaving money on the table by doing it the way they're doing it, but it sure feels like it feels it feels that they're overplaying that part. But anyhow, you know what I really want to get into?
Who's running the calculations, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they would sell 20% more beers if they dropped the price by 20%. I don't know. I'm not sure they do. I sort of, just a really quick thing, because I've been thinking about this lately because of my other job. I did a story a few years ago about bobbleheads. I happened to notice that a few teams were giving away literally 45,000 bobbleheads whenever they had a giveaway, a bobblehead giveaway. And that other teams were giving away 10 or 15,000.
Right.
And that didn't make any sense to me, because just wouldn't it seem that if you were that one of those models would make a lot more sense than the other model?
Right.
If they're that different. So I called around. I wanted to write about it. I called around to the different teams. I called some teams that gave away 45,000. The Brewers, for example. The Brewers guarantee a bobblehead to everyone who shows up. And I called a couple of teams that give away 10,000 or 15,000. There's not an answer.
Yeah.
Nobody could explain to me, on the low end anyway, why they only gave away 10,000. Basically, the answer was, well, that's just how we've always done it.
Right.
And so what that said to me was, you really haven't worked through the math on this, have you? You don't know if it's more profitable in the long run, or creates a better fan experience, or creates more goodwill with your fans if you give away 30,000 as opposed to 10,000.
Yes.
So they don't really know what the equation is. But I think you're right. I think the impulse is just to keep pushing the prices higher and see what happens. And as long as X number of people continue to spend the $10 for beer, they'll charge the $10.
Right.
But I don't know that there's a great deal of logic behind it. I could be wrong, but you think, and I do know that the analytics movement hasn't just seeped into player transactions. It's also in how much do we charge for tickets. Of course, you know about dynamic pricing for tickets. So one would think if there's an advantage in lowering your beer prices that somebody would do it. I just don't think it's happened yet.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say about all of that stuff too is the other decisions one of the things I've learned, Rob, from being out in combat zones is looking at organizations and how damaging they can be to their own outcomes, and it's all about affect versus effect, right? And you said, like, I don't buy beers because I find it offensive. I'm the same way. I'm like, you're offending me. You're being rude, Angels or Giants or Dodgers or whoever. That's not the desired outcome. That's not the desired impact from stimulus. That's the affect part. So there is value and efficiency that's being wasted when you don't know the answers to those, and you just look at a spreadsheet and say 45,000 bobbleheads equals a win. It doesn't. Things don't work like that. And you're right. There's got to be some kind of unmeasured negative impact and unrealized positive impact because of the lack of study on the affect side of the ledger.
Right.
Let me ask you this, too, along those lines. What about decisions, like you brought the Brewers up, and this is one of the things that bugs me about their stadium, is you have Bernie Brewer, this super exciting thing, and maybe this is just the crusty old man in me. As I record this on my birthday, I'm now 49. But it's always bothered me that they took away Bernie's beer mug and that he just has a flag-waving thing. I just don't get it. Like, it was so great. I remember as a kid, I loved watching him slide down that slide, and I waited for a home run. I was desperate for Robin Yount to hit one out, or Gorman Thomas, or any of those guys. And when they took the mug away, I was like, oh, you ruined such a good thing. I mean, granted, he's waving the Brewer flag, and maybe that's more exciting for his fans, but I really thought that they lost something with that. And I don't know what those things are across all of the stadiums. Like everybody's got some version of the hot dog race now and that kind of thing. And some of those things sort of, I don't know, it lacks it lacks creativity and imagination, it feels like. But maybe that's just the crusty old man in me. What are your thoughts on things like that when you try to make the ballpark experience better?
I think, again, nobody really knows. I will sound like an old man too. I'll say this, just because it pops into my head. I've been to a number of ballparks where the music between innings was literally so loud that you couldn't have a conversation with the person sitting next to you. Now that depends on where you're sitting and the speakers and all that, but true. But it's a fact that there's a lot of loud music in almost every ballpark now. And then don't get me wrong, I love loud music. I just don't want it playing when I'm trying to have a conversation with somebody. It's not about me being old. It's about me wanting to talk to people. For me, that's part of the experience of going to the ballpark. If you tell someone who works for a baseball team that, they will say, well, sure, that's you, but our fans love it. Really? How do you know? Right. Nobody knows, right? Nobody really knows how much more fans enjoy the $25 million video board than the $15 million video board. How could you know?
Right.
But it's always about being bigger and better and fancier. And meanwhile, you see teams like the Red Sox and the Cubs before they had their new video boards raking in the money because people wanted that old-time ballpark experience. Now they put the new video boards up anyway, and what they would say is we had to do it, our fans demanded it. But again, I don't know that anyone really knows that.
Yeah.
It's just, again, it's part of the machine. We employ 34 people in our promotions department, and they're telling us we have to spend more money on A, B, and C, so why wouldn't we do it? And that's just sort of how the business works, but they're just guessing. They don't know that people want louder music. I don't think they know.
Yeah.
And as far as Bernie the Brewer, I can't imagine why they got rid of the beer mug. That seems crazy to me. It can't be about the promotion of alcohol, considering how much alcohol is promoted in every single ballpark now. So it's strange.
Let alone the fact that they're called the damn Brewers, Right, exactly. Yes, and their logo is based on I think it's barley, right? Barley. It's barley, yeah.
So they're not making a big secret of it. I think that what I want in a team name, in a uniform, in a ballpark, is something that tells me, oh, this is where I am right now. I'm in Milwaukee. You can tell because there's a guy in a mug up there. I'm in wherever it might be. I have a sort of a visceral resistance to the homogenization of America. Strip malls,
yes.
Walmarts everywhere, fast food, and ballparks that all look the same.
Right.
And uniforms that all look the same. That's why I don't know what it is about talking to you, but my brain just goes a million different directions. But that's why the Padres have to wear brown uniforms and not blue.
Right.
A blue uniform says nothing. It doesn't tell me I'm in San Diego. It tells me nothing. It just tells me the Padres don't have the guts to be different. So it sounds like they're going to go back to brown in 2020. I don't know why it took this long. It's ridiculous. Speaking of nobody knows anything, their owner for years said, well, our surveys tell us the fans prefer the blue. Really? No, they don't. Come on.
Yeah.
You're just making that up because you don't want to change. But I guess they're finally going to do it after talking about or talking about not doing it for 6 or 8 or 10 years or whatever it's been. It looks like 2020 is the year. But why would it take so long? Why not embrace being different? Every ballpark should feel like you're in this place, in this city. And a lot of the newer ballparks do a great job with that. Not all of them, but a lot of them do.
I was thinking about this as I was walking through San Francisco the other day, and how if I was designing a new ballpark, because baseball's always on my mind, and I was thinking about you when I thought about this, was the symmetry of the asymmetry. Like it's very, we've managed to take an asymmetric thing and make it very cookie cutter, where every ballpark is pretty dang good, all of the modern ballparks, but there is a staleness to them because they're all built by the same people who are either copying themselves or someone's copying them. And I was trying to think of what the new, I don't know that the Rangers have enough forethought to get this any better than they did before when their new ballpark happens, but maybe at some point there'll be some kind of high density living unit that is built in, and they, sell some of those places as boxes. I don't know. Something unique is going to have to change at some point when these new stadiums come out, and there's some kind of variety where any ball that hits the facade of the I don't know, like the warehouse in San Diego that you can hit the ball off of, the metal company thing. Bring those things more into play. Like it's one thing to have it hit it once every 10 years from a 500-foot home run, but what if it was a little more frequently? Not to turn the game into a cartoon, but to give some context to the ball being hit 380 feet or whatever it is. I don't know.
Well, Pete, have you been to the Marlins?
Yeah.
Relatively new stadium.
Yes.
I've heard that. I haven't been there, but I've heard that's different than most of the other.
It is monstrous. The other thing is, when I talk about people making extravagant decisions, someone took a brief from the guy who pitched that home run device and said, yeah, you know what? It's a great idea.
Right.
And you see that thing, and it literally brings nothing to the ball game. That bark is so huge it's giant in its own little thing, but in the perspective of the ballpark,
it's gone now.
Yeah, right. And that's the other thing. It was like $30 million, and now that's like, never mind.
Right. Well, I think that, and I actually started saying that there. Sometimes, I guess this is what happens when you're old or older, which I certainly am. I see things and I think, oh yeah, I wrote that 20 years ago.
Right.
Nobody cares. So you really shouldn't say that very often. But I do recall very specifically writing back in the mid to late 90s that this new ballpark thing, this retro, what were they calling? They used to call them the retro ballpark craze.
Yeah.
We'd had enough of it.
Right.
And we needed to find what the next step was. And I think, frankly, the Marlins ballpark is probably part of that next step. It might not be perfect, but it's not the sort of, bricky, which you wouldn't want in Miami, by the way. It wouldn't make sense to have it there.
Yeah.
I haven't been, but my assumption was that the idea anyway was that the new ballpark in Miami would.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero, co-host of the Break It Down show and fellow producer here at Lions Rock Productions. And I'm proud to announce our newest show. It's called Justice. Season 1 is going to be a deep dive into some of the cases I personally worked on as a licensed private investigator, and you'll get a unique view into the criminal justice system that may just challenge some of your personal notions about how it should work and open your eyes in ways you never imagined. So keep your ears open for Justice, a brand new podcast coming in January from Lions Rock Productions to iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
Bricky, which you wouldn't want in Miami, by the way. It wouldn't make sense to have it there.
Yeah.
And I haven't been, but my assumption was that the idea anyway was that the new ballpark in Miami would be at least something of a piece with Miami's sort of famous architecture. And I think that the drawings for the ballpark in Portland, which frankly is highly unlikely to ever get built, but it doesn't look anything like any of the other new ballparks. So I think we're on. I haven't seen the drawings lately, but I don't think we're going to see anything interesting in Arlington. I could be wrong, but I think that we are headed for that. I think that the next ballpark in Oakland, if they get one, the next ballpark in, wherever. I know the drawings for the next ballpark in the Tampa Bay area look fantastic. Hasn't happened, might never happen, but I think we're heading in that direction. I think we are going to see a different form, a more interesting form than what we saw from, Camden Yards on, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know what? So it's supposed to be the Hall of Fame issue, but you and I are often running talking about ballpark construction. So let me yank the reins over to the left and let me put you on the spot for a second here. What is your prediction right now? And this show will go out when they announce the class. Who do you think, apart from Lee Smith and Harold Baines, who are already in, who do you think is going to join those guys on the stage this summer?
Well, it seems fairly obvious that Roy Halladay, well, it is obvious. Roy Halladay and Mariano Rivera are locks. It seems highly likely that Edgar Martinez is going to make the cut this year. He got 70% last year, and I think he'll probably clear 80% this year. So those three, I think, are obvious. And I think Mike Mussina might make it this year. I haven't looked at you might have it in front of you. I think Mike Mussina is certainly going to do better this year. He deserves to be elected. And I think he'll probably be in that 70 to 80% range. You need 75%, but I won't be surprised either way. It seems clear now that he's on a Hall of Fame trajectory. If it isn't this year, it's probably next year.
Yeah, and there's some room cleared, but the recent classes have kind of cleared some space for, because he is, for whatever reason, he is sort of a second cut, where there's the guys that have to get in front of him, like a Mariano Rivera. Yeah, you're right. Those four appear to be locks according to the Hall of Fame tracker that not Mr. Tibbs, what's his name, Ryan Thibodeau, that he puts out. But I will throw you a little bit of surprise. Curt Schilling, with 44% of the ballots known, Curt Schilling is at 73.9%. So easily within range of gaining election this year. And
I don't think he has a chance. I really don't. Not a good chance.
That could be, but I'm just saying, when you look at 44.7% of the ballots known and he's at 73.9%, that shocked me because of just his character and his nature. You would think he would struggle for votes.
Well, and he only got 50% last year. Basically.
Yeah. It does appear, though, that he will go in next year or the year after that, possibly. I'm not sure how many years he's got left in the ballot. But that is a shockingly strong showing. And then joining him with virtually the same numbers are Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds. What's changed to allow those, because those guys are obviously black marks, and now it appears that if they don't go in this year, they will go in the next two, if not this year already.
Well, again, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I find those projections predictive. The one question I've always had about these pre-election numbers is I'm not sure how predictive they are, because all those are the reported ballots,
right? And
I'm not sure how representative of the voting body those ballots actually are. The people who send their ballots in early. I think that they're people with unpopular opinions, or perhaps just people who aren't as wired into the internet or the web, which means basically older voters, might be less likely to submit early ballots. The fact that Bonds and Clemens have been stuck in the 50 to 55% range for a while now, why would they jump to 70+% this year?
Right.
Unless there was some huge change in the voting body, which I'm not aware of, why would they move up that high? I think that younger voters are more likely to both vote for Bonds and Clemens and to reveal their ballots before the results are announced. So I'm not saying they won't get into the 60s, which would be new for them, all three of those guys. I'll be really surprised if any of them clear 70% this year. Now, I think Schilling and Bonds and Clemens all have 3 more years after this. They presumably will inch upward every year. It wouldn't surprise me if 1 or 2 or all 3 of them wound up getting elected by their 10th year. I just don't think it's likely to happen this year, probably not next year. I do think it's interesting, though, even just the fact they're in the conversation, because go back 5 years and look at all the stories people wrote. These guys will never make it. And they were stuck in the low 40s, I think.
Yeah.
At that point. And it just seemed like every year would be 40% this year, 41% next year, 39% the next year. It seemed like there was a stasis there, and they just weren't going to escape being below 50%, but they have escaped, and I would agree they're going to keep inching up. I'm not sure if they're going to inch up quite enough in their 10 years, but it's probably surprising to some people that they're even in the conversation. It's not surprising to me. People tend to think that whatever they're seeing in front of their face is going to be the case forever. And life just doesn't work that way. The world's too complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, the world is complicated. The other thing is, and we've briefly talked about this in past episodes, is we're going to have to do something about the modern pitcher. You know, it's one thing to say so-and-so has 200 wins. I think wins have a different value now even than they did, say, 15 or 20 years ago. Mark Burley getting to 200-plus wins, he finished his own game. So this isn't some kind of weird thing where, you know, he came out in the fifth inning and then the bullpen, you know, got a series of holds and ultimately a save. This is a guy taking the ball, and 9 innings later, you know, he's done. What are we going to do about these pitchers that are sort of in this no man's land, like David Cone? You can make a solid case for David Cone. He's surrounded in terms of his career value by Hall of Famers. Andy Pettitte, you know, if Mike Mussina's going in, and it's pretty obvious he'll go in pretty easily, and he's got a fantastic overall contribution to winning. Andy Pettitte is not his twin, but you know they're cousins in terms of their impact. But Andy Pettitte doesn't have the same cachet. What are we going to do with these guys that are in between? Do they just have to wait for the tomorrow's game folks to put him in? Because Andy Pettitte seems to me like a Hall of Famer.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned those three guys you mentioned. I don't know if this was accidental or not. I was just looking them up as you were talking, and Pettitte and Cone and Burley have almost exactly the same wins above replacement, at least on baseballreference.com. Right around 60, which is sort of that's basically the definition of a borderline Hall of Fame pitcher historically. There are a lot of pitchers in the Hall of Fame who were lower than 60, but there are also a lot of guys who are at that range or a little higher that aren't in the Hall of Fame. Mussina is well above. That's why it seems so easy. Schilling, especially if you consider postseason, above that level. But those pitchers, those three have suffered not only from the decline of wins for starting pitchers, but also just the glut of pitchers like them. The ballot has been for many years now stuffed. To the point where a lot of good candidates don't even make it past 1 year. Lou Whitaker's fate should be embarrassing for, if not the Hall of Fame itself, certainly for the Hall of Fame voters. I think he fell off the ballot after 1 or 2 years. And frankly, Whitaker's got a better case than Burley or Cone or Pettitte, I think, at least based on things like wins above replacement. So it's tough out there.
Yeah.
If you're in that middle range and you don't have something that sort of puts you over the top, something that distinguishes you, like Cy Young Awards or throwing 100 miles an hour or something. Sure, all those guys. I think that the better example of the voters missing out because of wins is Mussina, who didn't win 20 games in a season until he was 38 years old or something?
Yeah, his last season. Yeah,
his last season. You know, if he hadn't done that, I don't think he'd be doing as well as he is. Because I've said this many times, but Hall of Fame voters they're attracted to shiny objects.
Yes. Whether
it's Gold Gloves, literally shiny, or MVP awards, or Cy Young awards, or 20-win seasons, or World Series rings. Also shiny, literally, and just plugging away at a high level like Mussina for year after year after year, or Tim Raines, or Bert Blyleven just doesn't really seem to has never gotten the voters very excited. That has changed. It's certainly changing. The voters are much smarter now, in my humble opinion. I'm not a voter, I can say that, than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago, I think. But they still have a long ways to go.
Yeah.
I mean, they do a pretty good job of not electing players who don't deserve it. They still miss out on players who do deserve it, like Mussina, like Schilling.
How about Kevin Brown and Rick Russell? They appear.
Kevin Brown.
Yeah.
Kenny Lofton fell off after 1 year, I think. I mean, there are a lot of really good players who still shouldn't say really good, a lot of great players who still don't fare as well as they probably should.
Yeah, when I'm looking at the thing too, I can see where Mussina was he quit early. He left some potential on the table, and I think that plays to his favor because he could have come back. So he finishes up with 270 wins. If he comes back and pitches 3 more years and does anything resembling what he's done up until that point in his career, he's staring down to 300 wins. And
Right.
all of a sudden he goes from being this, 6 wins less in his last year. If he has a 14-win year, he's struggling to get in the Hall of Fame. If he does that struggle for 3 more years, he's a mortal lock because he's a 300 winner. That's the difference over the course of a 20-year career.
Well, I think that's probably right, and there's no reason to think that he wouldn't have continued to be an effective pitcher at least for another year or two.
Right.
Obviously, he could have suffered a serious injury, but the amazing thing about his last season wasn't that he won 20 games. That could have happened any number of other times. He won 19 twice. He won 18 twice. But with better support, he could have won 20
Right.
a few times. But his last season, his strikeout rate was higher than his career average. His walk rate was lower than his career average. His strikeout to walk ratio was one of the best of his career. So I don't know how to explain it. It's been 10 years. That was 10 years ago. I don't know how hard he was throwing in 2008 when he was 39, but sure, he could have kept on pitching. He chose to retire because he wanted to, well, I shouldn't say, I don't know why. He certainly talked about wanting to spend time back at home with his family.
Yeah.
But he could have kept pitching. You're right. He would have improved his case. No matter how poorly he pitched,
Right.
his ERA wouldn't have gone up much. He just would have kept on tacking on the wins. And in the 280s or 290s, let alone 300, certainly he would have fared better in the Hall of Fame voting, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, does it?
It doesn't. Like there's when you look at Johnny Bench's career, there comes a point where he's no longer Johnny Bench. He's still playing and he's adding to his career totals, but his level of play is, I don't want to say pedestrian because it's never that. That's a hard job, but he's not playing like a Hall of Famer for, I think, the last 3 or 4 years of his career.
That's right.
So it's weird that this is what fascinates me about the Hall of Fame thing is someone like, so I was on the Adrian Beltre train from day one because he was starting so early, illegally early in terms of being signed, right?
Right.
And I remember watching Bill James's Favorite Toy and seeing how it just didn't have any real love projecting out, and I'm talking way back now. But at some point along the line, before 3,000 hits, but not a whole lot before, Adrian Beltre tripped the trigger and he became someone who was, better than a compiler and had actually, enough stellar play that he became an obvious Hall of Famer. But it wasn't obvious the 2 or 3 years before that. Like it was hard I was definitely one of the few people that's like, keep watching. He's still going. By the time he's done with as early as he starts, he's going to have a strong case. Giancarlo Stanton starts early. If he just has a mediocre last half of his career, he's still going to put up enormous numbers. What do you think about these guys that are creepers? That sort of Johnny Damon came very close to 3,000 hits, and it was shocking at the end. Like, oh my gosh, look how close he is. He didn't get there, but any number of little small things, and he'd be a 3,000 hit guy, and he doesn't feel like a Hall of Famer.
Well, no, he doesn't. And Beltre, you're right, didn't for a long time. But I think that's because Beltre's career is, I don't know that it might be unique in the sense that he arrived in the majors at 19 and really didn't have his first great season until he was 25, and then sort of puttered along until he was in his 30s. And then all of a sudden he took off in his 30s and was great almost every year. That just doesn't really happen. So in my mind, Beltre was not, yes, the compiling was happening. And shoot, he might have wound up with 3,000 hits or close to it, just having a normal sort of career progression. But the fact that he then started hitting 30 plus homers every year and hitting 300 all the way through his 30s almost, that's different. Damon, I remember very specifically looking at his numbers one day. This is when he was toward the end, and thinking, wait a second.
Yeah.
Somebody's going to make a Hall of Fame case for this guy. And I think Scott Boras actually did, as Damon was looking for one last contract. And of course, Scott Boras just makes things up, and Johnny Damon did not and does not look like a Hall of Famer at that time. He didn't. Um, but the fact that his numbers were what they were was kind of surprising. And with Harold Baines in the Hall of Fame, you can make a case for anybody with 2,800 hits. Rusty Staub, Johnny Damon, Vada Pinnan. I mean, the list doesn't go on that long because there aren't that many guys in that. Al Oliver, aren't that many guys in that 28 to 3,000 range. But there are a
Buckner.
few. Buckner, yep. We didn't typically think of them as Hall of Famers because they didn't do a great deal aside from rack up all those hits. But once you like Harold Baines, people can now make the argument that, hey, not only is this guy in the Hall of Fame, but we just put him in. We're not talking about Sam Rice here. We're talking about a guy we just put in the Hall of Fame. So yes, maybe Scott Boras should make the case again.
But is there okay? So Harold Baines gets in, and I like Harold Baines, and he had Hall of Fame elements to his game that I think are undisputable. But the package as a whole definitely doesn't see him like a Hall of Famer. But is that right? Have we had the bar unnaturally too high? Is there a place for Ken Brett, for heck, Tommy John, and all of these guys, Steve Garvey? Like, have we ignored guys? Because there's certainly guys that are above those. I was looking at John McCormick, who's a player from the 1800s, and you look at his career and you're like, why not? He's got his WAR is super high. So is there space for guys like that? Can we put Rick Russell and Kevin Brown in and just let those guys be Hall of Famers and maintain the integrity of the Hall?
Well, that depends on how we define integrity. I would argue, and everyone's going to have a different definition. You could certainly argue that the integrity of the Hall of Fame collapsed in the late 60s and early 70s when the Veterans Committee was putting everybody who played for the Cardinals or the Giants in, everybody from the 1920s and 30s who played for the Cardinals or the Giants. You could argue that the integrity was lost when the committee started electing, the Veterans Committee started electing people like Harold Baines and Jack Morris.
Yeah.
You could argue that the integrity was lost when the writers took a million years to put in Eddie Matthews, who at that time was the second or third greatest third baseman who'd ever lived, maybe the greatest.
Yeah.
Or Ron Santo, who they never elected, or Burt Blyleven, who they elected in the 14th or 15th year of eligibility. So it just depends on your definition. I would say that the Hall of Fame itself, and not the institution, the museum, for which I have an incredible amount of respect, but the Hall of Fame per se, that place where they hang the plaque, at some point in the last few years, if not before, it's occurred to me that the institution values different things or values things differently than I value them.
Huh.
And for that reason, it's gotten more and more difficult for me to be too concerned with who's in and who's out. And I've had friends who have said this for a long time. Will say things like, "I don't need the Hall of Fame to explain to me how great Mike Mussina was." And there's a lot to be said for that.
Sure.
We don't anymore need that. I don't know. With the metrics that we have now, I mean, 50 years ago, there was probably the best barometer of baseball greatness was the Hall of Fame. There was no other great source. There wasn't a baseball encyclopedia, really. If you want to list of the greatest baseball players, go to the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Go to the plaques. That's it. That's the best we've got. And that isn't true anymore. We don't need the Hall of Fame to tell us how great Mike Mussina was. But because I'm 52, I still have this vestigial affection and respect for that room with all the plaques. So on some level, it still does bother me when the Hall of Fame is sort of, the people who run the Hall of Fame seem disinterested in maintaining a certain standard for that room. I think the world of Harold Baines. By all accounts, he's a fantastic guy and was a great teammate, but it still offends some small part of me yet that the institution has created a process that would allow for Harold Baines to have a Hall of Fame plaque when um, his presence lowers the standards for that institution, and I think the standards should be higher. That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, I mean I think that's fair to say. You can take a look at Harold Baines' career, and it. Okay, let me ask you this then. In terms of Harold Baines getting into the Hall of Fame, he's got 2,866 hits. He also played through the era where a strikes robbed him of, is it fair to say, 100 hits? I mean, 94, 95. He played throughout the entire 80s. There's got to be 150 hits there. Like, he has to stay healthy, and you never know what's going to happen. But
Right.
is that all right? I'll ask you this: is that unfair to look at Harold Baines that way when you realize that he fought for and was impacted by players' rights and getting paid for those guys?
It's an interesting question, and I think that to some degree, well, I think we should take that into consideration. We should talk about it. I will say that it's never been that standard has never really been applied to other players. Uh, Tim Raines, for example, lost a great number of hits and stolen bases to two different strikes. I never heard anybody make the case for him. It took him forever to get elected, probably longer than it should have. Another player, I'm trying to think, Fred McGriff.
Yeah.
People say, well, if Fred McGriff had 500 home runs, he might have been elected. Well, he would have had 500 home runs if it wasn't for the strike in '94, right?
Yeah.
I think
Absolutely.
if we're going to use that argument, we should be consistent with it. And to this point, nobody's used it consistently.
It is used in Ted Williams' favor, though.
It
And
is.
Bob
But
Feller.
he was always going to be a first ballot guy anyway.
But
You're
it's
right,
always brought up when you bring those two guys up.
Brought up with in regard to Williams
Yeah.
and Bob Feller.
Yeah.
It's often been talked about. Of course, I will say this: it's never been used in the other direction. In my opinion, Lou Boudreau would not have Hall of Fame numbers if he hadn't played throughout the war years.
Yeah.
But nobody's ever held that against him,
Right.
for better or worse. What I would say is this: if there had never been a strike, Harold Baines might well have been elected by the writers because he cleared 3,000 hits or came incredibly close. It's possible, but I would have argued against voting for him. I don't believe that 3,000 hits should be an automatic qualifier, although it always has been.
Right.
500 home runs was once an automatic qualifier too. It's no longer an automatic qualifier. At some point, it becomes easier to compile numbers for various reasons. In the case of home runs, the game just became more oriented toward home runs, so a lot more guys hit 500 home runs. You could argue that it became easier to get 3,000 hits or close to 3,000 hits when they introduced the designated hitter because you could play more.
Right.
Certainly Harold Baines would not have had as long a career without the DH rule. The same is probably true of Dave Winfield. The same is probably true of Paul Molitor and
Edgar Martinez.
Other players who wound up with big numbers.
Right.
Frank Thomas.
Yeah. It's a weird thing when you get to that razor's edge and you really focus on it, things become less clear. There's all these. Gary Sheffield belongs in that conversation. Here's a guy that is at his prime. What is he? Is he 90% as good as Barry Bonds, who was way over 20% better than the average Hall of Famer? Does Gary Sheffield suffer because he's just not quite as good as Barry, not quite as much of a compiler as Barry, but boy, in his time, if you wanted to beat somebody, you would love to have him at the plate. I mean, same kind of approach, super patient. Don't you dare throw a fastball. Don't throw many things near the strike zone, and he'd punish him. But he has this, obviously a little bit of a steroid taint to him, but he doesn't feel like a Hall of Famer for some reason. And I can't for the life of me figure out why I feel that way.
Right. Well, I think that in Sheffield's case, his personality has hurt him some. The fact that he played for a million teams has hurt him some. The fact that he was an acknowledged steroid user has hurt him some, although, he claims that, I think he claims he didn't know what he was doing. It was a lotion or a cream that he rubbed on his skin.
Right.
Who knows?
Yeah.
But it's easy for a player like Sheffield to get lost among all the other guys who might have used drugs, who hit a lot of home runs. Was Sheffield a greater hitter, more devastating hitter than Jim Rice? Of course he was. But there were a lot of guys in the 2000s who were better hitters than Jim Rice were. And it's just hard to find room for all of them on your Hall of Fame ballot or intellectually. I think that you could make roughly the same case for Gary Sheffield that you could make for Edgar Martinez.
Yeah.
People love Edgar Martinez as a Hall of Fame candidate. I suspect, without looking at it, that their wins above replacement are roughly equivalent. They made roughly the same defensive contributions, which is to say very little. But Edgar Martinez is a popular candidate because he played for the same team. People liked him. He never got popped for drugs. And Sheffield can't say those things. But, realistically, if you had a choice between one of those guys in a big moment with a lefty pitcher on the mound, who do you choose? I don't know. They were both fantastic. So, no, you're right. But there has been a glut of outstanding players on the Hall of Fame ballot for, I don't know what it is, a decade or more now.
Yeah.
And it's difficult for the voters to sort them out. When you can vote for 10 and there are 15 guys on the ballot who literally do have Hall of Fame numbers, what do you do with that? You have to make some distinctions. And you can make them overtly or explicitly, or you can make them implicitly. And I think a lot of the arguments against Sheffield have not been explicit. That doesn't mean they're unfair. It just means that they're hard to articulate.
When it comes to a guy like Rick Russell or Kevin Brown or Mark Burley, all of these players that have some form of a pretty solid case, those guys aren't warm, lovable Edgar Martinez type guys. Maybe Rick Russell was a little bit, but he's been done for so long, who knows? We made Ron Santo wait until after he was dead. And I hate that. I hate that Kenny Stabler had to wait until after he was dead to get in, because it breaks my heart for those guys, because they're such great champions for the game and for their team and everything else. Do you have room for a couple extra Harold Baineses if we can get Lou Whitaker in? For whatever reason, Lou struggles to get in. Is it okay to lower the bar a little bit and let some other guys in so we can let some truly deserving people in?
I just don't know where one draws the line.
Yeah, I don't either. I don't either.
Because if you go down to 60 WAR, which is about where Sheffield is, by the way, along with those other pitchers we talked about earlier,
right,
and probably Russell. I think Russell's actually a little bit better than that. But
yeah.
Nobody knew it at the time, obviously.
Right.
Now we're looking at a massive group of players, not only the 14 or 15 guys, or 16 if you want to include Jeff Kent, which a lot of people do, or Fred McGriff, which a lot of people do, or Lance Berkman, which people do. I've seen cases for Lance Berkman. I don't understand it, but I've seen it. You look at the ballot right now, this year's ballot, just ranking by wins above replacement. I'm going down to number 20, number 19, which is Roy Oswalt. People make the case for him. 20, Miguel Tejada. People don't make a case for. Omar Vizquel, people do make a case for, unaccountably, in my opinion, but
right
there it is. So now we're looking at basically 20 guys on the ballot this year who people are making, literally 20 guys who are reasonable people are making Hall of Fame cases for, serious Hall of Fame cases for. Now, you might not believe that Jeff Kemp belongs in, or that Lance Berkman belongs in, or that Omar Vizquel does, but a lot of smart people do. Okay?
Yeah.
That's 20 people on just this ballot alone. Now let's extend those benchmarks back 50, 100 years. Now how many players are we talking about? I'm guessing at least at 50. Who are in that at least 45 to 50 wins above replacement. It's difficult to create a mechanism that allows for all of those players to be elected or even seriously considered. I mean, look at what the Hall of Fame has done with players like Bobby Grich, who can't even get a sniff,
right?
Or Lou Whitaker. or Rick Russell, not even being considered essentially. So it's a difficult thing. I think the best that the Hall of Fame could do in the short term is create a process that allows for the most deserving candidates to be elected, the ones who elevate the standard for a Hall of Famer, then figure out, is there a smart way to consider the players who we might have missed for whatever reasons, like Whitaker or Gritch or Rick Russell.
Right.
Right now, the process, I think, is to some extent broken. And I don't see any reason to think that anyone at the Hall of Fame is trying to fix it. Doesn't mean it won't get fixed. It just might not be for another 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the meantime, you have someone like Todd Helton who has no idea. Nobody has any idea what to do with him. It's just, he's one of those guys where Adrian Beltre's not penalized for playing in Texas. Certainly, struggled in Seattle compared to what he did in Texas. But Todd played his whole year in Colorado and hit well on the road. And, we know how hard the transition between the road and home is for folks in Colorado. But we just don't know what to do with him or Larry Walker. Heck, you could even say the same thing about anybody who played for a long time in Colorado, that there's a limiting factor by playing there, but that same thing does not apply for a place like Texas or any of the other ballparks that have a positive impact on a specific player's skill set.
Well, right. And look, Coors Field is more extreme than any other ballpark and has been since the day it opened. What I would say about Walker and Helton is that there are different arguments there. Helton he had a longer career than Walker, or at least a healthier career than Walker. But Walker was much more valuable on the bases and in the field. And in my mind, that's what people miss. It's the whole. That's what voters miss. It's the whole ball player.
Right.
And we go back to what I mentioned earlier about shiny objects. Larry Walker was a fantastic all-around ball player. He didn't do any one thing particularly well. Well, he did. He was a great right fielder for a few years, but it wasn't something that people talked about a great deal. And certainly it isn't something people talk about a great deal now. Now, if you're not Roberto Clemente, it doesn't matter how good you were in right field. But Walker was an outstanding fielder, an outstanding base runner, as I recall from the numbers, and a fantastic hitter. But he didn't do any one thing well enough where people really remember it. And I think that's hurt him. Just as it's hurt Scott Rowland. I would vote for Walker or Rowland ahead of Helton because of the other things that they did, in addition to being outstanding hitters. So I actually think that Helton's going to wind up getting in because of his career batting average and how many hits he got, and people are going to forgive him Coors Field. And he might do better than Larry Walker, although I don't think he deserves it. But you're right. It does. Really what it comes down to is we need more voters who look at everything, the whole picture.
Yeah.
And we have more. Every year there are more voters who do that.
Right.
And so I think the BBWA voting is getting better. The Veterans Committee voting is getting worse. And on balance, looking at the entire picture, the Hall of Fame is not improving because the standards are being lowered, and they should be getting higher.
Maybe their job is the hardest, though, right? Because there are corrections to make, so they have to exist. But how do you account for the players that are just hard to account for? Hey,
right.
One more question. Okay, so if Harold Baines is the Tour de France's Red Lantern for baseball's Hall of Fame, right? If he's the last guy, who's not in? Who's that person who's like, it doesn't make any damn sense, but okay, we can do it. My guy will be Kenny Rogers. I'm not making a case for Kenny Rogers. I'm just saying that if you're behind Kenny Rogers, you have no chance.
Well, again, I'm not, given what happened with Baines, I'm not sure where we can draw that line. I hadn't even thought about Kenny Rogers as a Hall of Fame candidate. Is there a case for him?
He's got 220 wins. He pitched forever.
Right.
He had a pretty good peak. He is by no measure a bad player. He was a great player to have around, but he was always like a 3-2 in a 5-man rotation.
Well, right, and look, there are probably 15 or 20 pitchers in the Hall of Fame who weren't as good as Kenny Rogers. Certainly,
Right.
at least more than a dozen. You could say the same thing about, by the way, right in the same category, David Wells,
Yeah.
who will never get an ounce of Hall of Fame support. But he's one of those guys, and there are a lot of them
Right.
who are better than a fair number of players who are in the Hall of Fame. David Wells was on the ballot one time, and he received 5 votes. Kenny Rogers probably about the same.
Yeah,
at
got it.
best. I don't know where that line is. It's not difficult to find the line when it comes to the BBWA ballots. That's actually fairly predictable. And people have written books. Most recently, Jay Jaffe, of course,
Right.
have written books analyzing these things. And there's so much data on Hall of Fame elections that, aside from the drug issue, which complicates things quite a bit, it's not hard to figure out who's going to get in and who isn't, and where that line is. Omar Vizquel is going to blow a lot of things out of the water if he continues to improve. But I don't think he'll actually get elected by the BBWA. I think he will get elected by a Veterans Committee someday if they're still using that same process. But my point is, once you acknowledge that there's a path for Harold Baines and Omar Vizquel, it's difficult to know where that line is.
Yeah.
It really is. But it's also not clear that path will still exist 5 years from now. The Hall of Fame voting procedures, aside from the BBWA election, have been in flux since day one.
Yeah.
Basically, if you don't know what that process looks like, who the voters are going to be, how many voters there are going to be, you can't know if there's a path for Vizquel, if there's a path for Harold Baines. So I really don't know. They might just throw the doors open 5 years from now and expand the membership by 20%. Who knows?
Yeah. Because there's always that if-then test. Like, if Omar Vizquel gets in, then why not Mark Belanger?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, people will say, well, nobody else had as many gold gloves as Vizquel, who's not in. Okay, that's fine. And that's what was said about Baines. He had this many RBIs, 100 RBI seasons or whatever it was. But really, what it's going to come down to, Pete, is which 12 people are in that room on that particular day, who those personalities are and how much influence they have and how much horse trading they can do. We're back to the late 60s and early 70s where it was all about who's in that room. And when you get 12 people in a room, good luck predicting what they're going to do. Human nature is a really weird thing.
Yeah.
So I don't know what's going to happen, or who's going to be in the Hall of Fame 10 years from now.
Yeah, me neither. Hey, listen, I've had you for an hour, and I don't want to abuse your time, and it's always great to chat with you, and I'm positive we could do this again. Heck, we could have kept going on stadiums, I'm sure.
Yep, and beer prices.
Yes, exactly. But everybody should check out Rob's book. It's called Powerball. I'm telling you right now, it's fantastic. If you like baseball at all, and you want to understand like what the modern game looks like from someone like Rob's perspective, it's like he's your best friend and you're there and he's talking to you as you play the game, as the game goes on, and he picks a great game that's got lots of drama and everything else. You guys should get this book. It's fantastic. And Rob won't let you down with his writing. Just if you guys are into the baseball thing, in general, check out Rob's book. He's got some things coming up, too, that we can't quite announce yet, but look for Rob on Twitter at Rob Neyer, and you will see what I'm talking about in the fairly near future. Rob, anything in closing?
I would just add to that, and thank you for the ringing endorsements. There are some exciting things coming up I can't wait to tell people about. And also, if you live in or are visiting the Pacific Northwest this year or this summer, please come out to a West Coast League game. We have 12 teams from Bend and Corvallis down south all the way up to Victoria and Kelowna, British Columbia. So it's really a fantastic experience. Baseball in the Pacific Northwest at one of the intimate ballparks in the setting with the mountains in the background. It's just I would say this even if I weren't the commissioner, but it's just a wonderful way to experience baseball. Please come out and join us.
Commissioner Rob Neyer, everybody.